Okay, we are now going to talk about biological molecules. Molecules that are incredibly important for life processes. Now, there are many molecules, many things that are important. We've learned about some of these smaller molecules like water, H2O. We all know that from grade 9 and 10. Carbon dioxide, we breathe that out. But there are molecules in biology that are much more than just, a little carbon atom holding hands with an oxygen atom. Here's carbon dioxide drawn in its structural form, two O's, right, sharing electrons with the carbon to make these little bonds. That's a small molecule. Biological molecules that are much bigger are called macromolecules. Macromolecules. Macro meaning big guys. And we're going to talk about some of these big guys, just a few of them, and get some under our belt. They're pretty much all made, as I said in the last video, with carbon atoms, hydrogen atoms, oxygen atoms. Those are by far the most. And then every once in a while, you'll see some nitrogen atoms, some phosphorus atoms, and some sulfur atoms. And then every once in a while, you'll see other tiny things like some selenium or some calcium or all kinds of other little atoms. But by far, these are pretty much the only atoms that actually make up 99% of living matter. It's pretty impressive that out of all the 100 and some elements that we have available, all you need is a handful, 5 or 6 of them, to make most of biology. Pretty crazy. Okay, so let's start drawing some pictures. I'm going to go back to black because I like the contrast of that color. Okay, so the first group of macromolecules are the carbohydrates. I'm sure you've heard of that word. People who are involved in fitness and health are always talking about carbs, and they say, first of all, you got to have more carbs because they give you energy, and now they're saying, ooh, some carbs aren't good for you, and they keep changing their mind on how carbohydrates are, how they should be used in your diet and so on. And the reason they keep changing their mind is because most of the people making up all these things aren't really actually scientists. They're people who sort of learn a little bit, but sometimes a little bit is just enough to be dangerous, And so we have all kinds of problems. Hopefully by the time you're done grade 12, you will understand the deeper complex biochemistry of carbohydrates, and you'll be able to decide for yourself whether carbohydrates are good or bad for you. It turns out that, like anything in biology, a little bit is good and too much is bad. That's pretty much the theme for anything, right? Everything in moderation, my grandfather used to say. Okay, so carbohydrate, it gives you an idea. Hydrate makes you think of hydration, which is water. Water is made up of H's and O's, H2O, and carbo, of course, is carbon. So what we find is carbohydrates are made up of C's, O's, and H's only. That's all. Those are the atoms that we find in them. I'm going to draw you a nice, simple, very common carbohydrate picture. Now, they're complicated. They're not as simple as like carbon dioxide that we drew before. I want you to imagine a carbon atom here, and he's going to be sharing his electrons with another carbon atom right up here. And then over here, yet another carbon atom. And then over here, another one sharing electrons. And then over here, another one. On this side, though, they're sharing with an oxygen atom. So we get this weird hexagonal ring shape. Then this carbon here is also sharing with another carbon atom. And he's sharing with 2 H's on one side and an O and an H on the other side. And then on this side, this little carbon is also sharing electrons with an H, because remember, carbon can share in 4 different places, right? Because it has 4 electrons in its outer orbit. And so it holds hands 4 times. And then over here, there's an O. Here's an oxygen holding hands with an H, and here's another H. Over here, we have an oxygen holding hands with an H, and then another H like this. And then up here, we have an O and an H and an H. And we get this big molecule. If you count up all the C's, you'll find there are 6 of them. So we can shortcut by saying 6 C's, or C6. If you count up all the H's, And you count the H2, of course, is 2 H's. So if you count them all up, you'll get 8, you'll get 12 of the H's. C6H12, and then if you count all the O's, there will be 6 of them. So this molecule is sometimes written in a short form like this, but this is what its structure actually looks like. And of course it has a name. It's called glucose. And it's one of the most famous carbohydrates because it's the simple sugar molecule. It's a form of sugar. All sugars, or almost all sugars, end with ose. When you see O's, that means it's some kind of a sugar molecule. Or we could call it this one is called a monosaccharide, but we won't get into all those details. This is one kind of carbohydrate, a sugar molecule. There's another sugar molecule I can show you just for fun, and it is a carbon atom here. This time it's got an oxygen atom at the top. It looks like a little pentagon shape. The carbon atom here, and then down below is a carbon over here and a carbon over here, and they hold hands like this. This one holds hands with an O and an H. Down here there's another C, and it's holding hands with an H2 on one side and an OH on the other. And then right here there's an OH, and over here there's a hydrogen, all holding hands. You shake up these guys in a cup and they just get together and hold hands like this. It's crazy. And then an O and an H here. This molecule is a little bit different. Now what's interesting about this molecule is if you count it, if you count the O's and the C's and the H's, you'll get exactly the same count. C6H12O6. But it's a different arrangement, which goes to show you that in biology, not just how many atoms you have, but the arrangement of the atoms is critically important. This is another sugar, and it's called fructose. It's a fruit sugar. It's what makes apples taste sweet, and we find it in strawberries and other fruit. These two sugars are examples of simple sugars. Simple sugars are the first sort of group of carbohydrates. Now, simple sugars can be simple like this, but they can also do something really cool. They can stick together. If I take that first molecule of glucose, and what I'm going to do is draw it as a shortcut. You see how it's a hexagon shape, like that? Well, when we draw molecules like this, there's so many C's, we stop drawing the C's and we just realize that every corner is a C, right? Except for this one, which would be an O, an oxygen, right? And then, of course, we can draw those other parts in over here. But instead of drawing it all, I'm just going to, all these little sections right here, I'm just going to draw these lines and, not worry about the details because they don't matter. But that's a glucose with all the details filled in. And then it can join up with this other shape, which is the pentagon shape, right? See the pentagon here of fructose. So that's the fructose shape, and of course it has all these things that are sticking sort of out of it. There's the fructose molecule joined up. And when they join up, they turn into a new sugar called sucrose, which is the sugar that's on your table at home in your sugar bowl. So simple sugars can be, so what we have are simple, we call these the simple sugars. And they can be monosaccharides, two C's in that, SACCHARIDES, which means the first two examples, one molecule of sugar, or they can be two stuck together, which are called disaccharides. Okay? And I gave you some examples. There's many more. There's maltose, there's lactose, there's anything that ends with ose, right, is going to be somehow related to these sugars. So those are the simple sugars. But now all the carbohydrates can do something really cool. If two can join together, why can't 3 or 4 or 5? And so the next group is what we call polysaccharides. And these are many sugars joined together. Polysaccharides. So you could have, I'm just going to draw little hexagons here. These are glucose molecules, and you could stick them all together and make a whole chain of glucose molecules like this. And you could put 4, you could put 50, you could put 2,615 of them all stuck together in a chain. When we make chains out of molecules, we call them polymers. Poly means lots, right? A polymer is a chain. And so carbohydrates can be simple sugars of one or two molecules stuck together, or they can be many, many molecules stuck together. And when they do that, we call them starches. So you've heard of starch, right? Cornstarch, different starches. A starch is simply a bunch of sugars stuck together. And usually it's many, many, many sugars. It could even be hundreds of them, right? So these are more complex. We call these the complex carbohydrates because they're so complicated. So these are complex carbohydrates. You'll hear nutritionists and people like that talk about complex carbohydrates, right? And in fact, they'll say that these are the ones you should try to eat more of. The simple sugars are sort of the ones that maybe cause more health problems. If you eat too many of them, that's the issue. But here's the cool thing. Why would biology even have these complex starches? Well, because glucose is the primary energy source. When you eat food, you tend to eat things that have been made by plants. So you eat some corn on the cob. Well, corn on the cob is full of starch. That starch goes into your body, and it has to be taken apart. It's no good to you as a big long chain. It has to be broken down or digested and turned into individual glucose molecules that are separate from each other again. So digestion is the process of taking these bigger molecules and breaking them back down into their most simplest components, like, for instance, the glucose molecule, which we use to get our energy. Okay, so just to summarize, you have carbohydrates as the big group made of C's, H's, and O's, and you have the simple sugars, which are one or two molecules. There's two of them. There's the monosaccharides, which are one sugar, and there's the disaccharides, which are two sugars stuck together. And then you have, that's sort of the one group of carbohydrates. And then the second group of carbohydrates are the polysaccharides. Saccharide, that means sugar. Polysaccharide, it's a polymer of sugars, which means it's made up of many hundreds of them put together. And these make big molecules called starches. Now, what's interesting is starches, of course, what these molecules tend to do is two important things. They are two important functions of these carbohydrates. Energy storage. These molecules contain lots of energy because they have lots and lots of bonds. In chemistry and biology, when we talk about energy, we're usually talking about the bonds between atoms. It's just like, imagine if you were holding hands with someone and you were trying to pull away from each other. And you're pulling, but you're holding hands. So there's a sort of tension between you. And if you let go and break the bond, then that energy is released, and what happens is you both go flying. So bonds, chemical bonds, are what we mean by energy. And molecules with lots of chemical bonds that are easily broken can store energy. So energy storage is what these molecules are for. But also, they are for structure. There's starches, which we tend to eat, but starches are not always food. Some starches, some polysaccharides, for instance, I'm going to use structure here as an example. And so there's a polysaccharide made up of a whole bunch of sugars called chitin. And chitin is a weird molecule that is actually what a lot of insect shells are made of. Insect shells are essentially made out of sugars, which is pretty cool. There's another one, cellulose. It ends in ose. Cellulose is a polysaccharide that is found in the cell walls of plants, and it allows them to be stiff and rigid so that they can take their shapes and forms. It's also, we call it fiber in the nutrition world, cellulose. So that fiber doesn't get broken down into little molecules. It stays as a big molecule in our bodies because we don't have the proper mechanisms to break it down. And it pushes stuff through, right? Keeps your intestines clean. So energy storage, but also structure for plant cells and other functions as well, these carbohydrates. Okay, that's it for carbohydrates. Number two, the second large group of macromolecules are the lipids. Lipids are fats and oils. So if you think about things you're aware of, like, you have a vegetable oil in your cupboard. Vegetable oil. That's a lipid. You have fish oils. You've heard of the oils inside fish. Greases, anything. Lard that you cook with. Butter. Those are all fats and oils. They tend to be greasy. Some of them are very liquidy and runny, and some of them are more thick, like butter, and they kind of form like a big solid mass. But all of these are lipids. And lipids have a very complex sort of structure as well. They're also made of carbons, hydrogen, and oxygen molecules. I'm going to give you an example of one lipid, just one. And so basically, you take a molecule that has a C here, and a C here, and a C here, just three of them. On this side, there's an H, and an H, and an H. There's also an H at the very top and an H at the very bottom. Now, don't write this. If you're making notes as we go, stop for a second, because I'm going to draw it like this first, and then I'm going to show you something cool. This little molecule is called glycerol. When you see the word glyc is a good indicator you're talking about a lipid. Now this little molecule, what's interesting is these H's, that's why I didn't want you to draw it. These H's right here can pop off. One could pop off, and what could happen is a big long chain of carbon atoms could attach. C, 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 C. And this could go on. You could have like 50 of them. And then on top of each of them, right over here, there would be an O and an H. And then all the rest around here would be hydrogens, all in this big long chain on both sides, hydrogens top and bottom. Because remember, carbon has to hold hands 4 times. And so this long chain is like a big tail that sticks out. And you could have one tail, but you could also attach another tail right here and have a second tail, or attach a third tail. And so what we have here are a one-tail is called a monoglyceride. A two-tail is called a diglyceride. And a three-tail is called a triglyceride. Glyceride, triglyceride. Okay? So I've drawn a monoglyceride, but if I add the other tails. And so these lipids all form some of the different fats and oils and things that are found in our bodies and in the food that we eat. Lipids are also tremendously good energy storers because there's many, many bonds that can be broken apart. And they also form structures, right? And they also allow for a lot of things to happen. So in terms of forming structures, what I want you to do is I want you to look at, didn't mean to do that. I want you to look at this part right here. And then I want you to imagine something that has 2 chains on it, or 2 tails. So essentially it's this picture. What does that look like to you? In the last video, we drew a cell membrane that had these little molecules, and I drew them like this. And the reason is because this is what we would call 2 tails, diglyceride, right? This is a diglyceride molecule, and the job of this molecule, or the role that it plays, is that it forms a cell membrane. Remember, with the protein stuck in the middle. So a cell membrane is made mostly of lipid. It's made of fat. It's made of lipid. And what happens is a little bit of phosphorus gets attached to these, and they're actually called phospholipids because there's a phosphate group, phospholipids. But it's still a lipid, and it is a diglyceride. So that's a very important role for these lipids. They can form cell membranes. They are also used, so essentially energy storage again, Now, the difference between the energy storage of fats and the energy storage of carbohydrates is carbohydrates are kind of temporary energy storage, and they're used up very quickly, whereas fats and oils are more long-term energy storage. They can store energy for quite some time. Animals build up stores of fat in their bodies so that when times are rough and they can't find food, they can use the energy in the fats, right? Of course, for humans, our biggest problem is we very seldom have times of hardship where we don't eat. And so most of the time we have too much energy. And so we just keep storing fat. And unfortunately, that can lead to all kinds of health issues if we end up with too much. But in Mother Nature's world, where there are no refrigerators and animals have to work hard to get food, they often have to go many, many hours or days without eating, so they rely heavily upon these long-term storages of fat in their bodies. So energy storage, but also structures, like the cell membrane. And one other thing, these lipid molecules can also make a special class of molecules called steroids. Steroids are another form of lipid. And steroids are molecules that they often are involved in biochemical reactions. Two of the most common steroids are testosterone. You've heard of that. It's the boy hormone. And another one is estrogen. These steroids are formed from lipids. So lipids can also become what we call hormones, which are essentially chemical messengers. So lipids can be chemical messengers called hormones. Messengers. And steroids are one of the forms of these chemical messengers. There's actually many kinds. So very important molecules, lipids. Okay, one last thing, two last things. One long one, one short one. Proteins. Proteins are next. What are proteins? Well, proteins are another kind of polymer molecule. They're made up of a whole bunch of little molecules. The little molecules are called amino acids. And all the amino acids have something in common. They all have this chemical structure as their main part. These ones have an N in them. Proteins have nitrogen, so they have C's, H's, and O's, but they also have N, and they often have some S as well. So they are a little more complicated. They have a few more atoms. Then right here, attached to this C, biochemists use an R, which means it could be several different things. There are about 20 different kinds of amino acids, at least ones that are essential to living things, and they all have different things attached here. So I'll give you an example. One particular one has another C. Let me get my pen back. It has a carbon atom with two H's attached on one side and an OH attached on the other. And it's called serine. If you see something ending in ine, you'll be able to recognize that it's probably an amino acid. So there's things like serine and glycine and leucine, and there's about 20 of them that we commonly use in biology. So a different one would have this removed, and there would be another structure. Maybe there would be, I think there's one, it's actually called tryptophan. It doesn't have the ine ending because there's always exceptions to the rule in biology, which is what makes it so complicated. But it has an actual little carbon-shaped, come on, pen. It has like a little carbon-shaped ring attached to it with C's all around. And so each amino acid has a different thing in this spot, so we just put an R there. But they can all attach to each other, and they can make a chain. So a chain of amino acids is what produces a protein. So a protein is really a chain of amino acids. So let's take one little long line. Here's the chain. And sometimes what happens is the chain will get twisted and curled up. So instead of being a long line, the chain will take a spirally twist to it like this. And that's because of the way the atoms, usually it's because of little sulfur atoms along here that just don't fit nice and straight. So they cause bends and kinks in the molecule. And then what can happen is another another chain of amino acids will produce another kinky line like this. And then the two of those will become sort of tangled up together like this and become this big ball, which I said before looks like a big ball of string. But really what it is it's tangled up strings of amino acid molecules all joined together. And these proteins make these complex structures. In grade 12, you'll learn more about that. Proteins, of course, are very important because they're so complex and so big. Proteins are huge. They're huge molecules. They can contain hundreds, if not thousands, of atoms. And so they are very diverse, which means there's many different kinds of proteins. And they do tons of jobs. They do a lot of important jobs. And proteins are typically molecules that are like regulators. So the proteins in the cell membrane can regulate what goes in and out of the cell. They are regulators. They can serve as hormones and send messages throughout bodies. They can help build structures. Proteins are like structures. Your hair is a protein. Your fingernails are a protein. They're all kind of different. All kinds of things. So proteins, I'm going to put etc. here. Proteins are perhaps the most diverse of all the biological molecules, and perhaps you could argue that they do the most. There are so many. There are literally hundreds of thousands of different proteins out there that do all kinds of things. They often serve also as enzymes. An enzyme is a chemical helper. You've heard of a catalyst? Well, an enzyme is a biological catalyst, and what it does is it helps other reactions take place. Reactions that normally would never take place or would take forever to happen, in the presence of a properly shaped protein molecule, they could happen very quickly. So they are helper molecules, and they do a ton of things. And of course, the other things that proteins make up are muscles. Muscles are the organs in our bodies that are made primarily of protein. Most of what we eat as meat is mostly protein, right? When we eat, we're eating the muscles of animals. And so protein is a huge component of muscle. And that's an important aspect in terms of digestion. Last group, we're almost done. I'll go back to my black pen, are the nucleic acids. And we won't say much about these because we've already talked about them. They are essentially DNA and RNA. And we kind of know what those are like. They are polymers as well, remember? They are long chains. They are chains of a ribose sugar or a deoxyribose sugar attached to a phosphate, which was a little cross shape. I think we drew these pictures. And then over here they had the A, the G, the C, or the T attached. And then, of course, you can attach another phosphate cross here with another ribose sugar and a C, and then the process just carries on, right? So they're polymers. G, C, C, A, T, whatever the case may be. RNA is a single strand. DNA has an additional strand upside down on the other side, right? A whole strand, so this will be next to a C, a G, and an A, and then the upside down ribose and the cross, and so on. So it's a double layer. These are the nucleic acids. And if you go back in your notes, you have pictures of this. When we were doing genetics, we spent more time drawing these pictures, so I won't draw them all again. And of course, the nucleic acids are the genetic code. In other words, it's the instructions. Not just the instructions for how to build and make bodies, but also the instructions for how the bodies function. Because what DNA actually does, believe it or not, is DNA is the code, and we said this before, for proteins. So DNA are the instructions for how to put these molecules together, right here, to make these great big giant blobs of string called proteins. And so once you make these, and of course these proteins then are very diverse and they do all these jobs. So that's how genes can control living things by determining what proteins are made so that certain jobs get done. And that sort of ends our foray into the main sort of groups of macromolecules or biological molecules. The carbohydrates, which is divided up into the simple sugars and the complex carbohydrates, or the polysaccharides, starches. The lipids, which are the fats and oils, and of course the most famous one is the phospholipid bilayer of the cell membrane, and so on. And then, of course, we have the proteins, which are the amino acid chains, and the nucleic acids, right? That's the main groups. In grade 12, you will learn even more about the chemistry of these, but for now, we just want to get the hang of it, just sort of know what they're like.